Ladies and gentlemen, I am so delighted to be here this afternoon. And I was not here for Dr. Farrell's presentation, but I was here for the last panel, which I thought was an excellent panel. And as was said at that last panel, so many services that we as citizens consume are delivered to us via public entities. So whether it is health, in Jamaica, we have SARA and we have our National Health Fund. SARA is the board that deals with hospitals in certain regions, or it is housing where we have our housing, National Housing Trust, or the Housing Agency of Jamaica, or garbage collection, or Solid Waste Management Authority, or water, or National Water Commission, or roads, or NWA, National Works Agency, and I could go on. All of these in Jamaica are public entities, state-owned enterprises. And so how they operate affect us as citizens, and they affect us in fundamental ways. Now, if these entities run well and they fulfill their mandates, this is good for us as citizens, but it's also good for the government because the government has come to us as the citizens of the nation and they have said to us, allow us to govern you and we will do certain things. The government then, when we elect them because we want them to do all that they have promised for us, they then issue mandates or general policy directions to the boards of these state-owned entities. And we have to be sure that these boards are sufficiently competent and are able to carry out the mandates that have been given to them by the government and that are the basis on which they have been elected to govern by the people of Jamaica. So the legislation which creates many of these state-owned enterprises or their articles of incorporation under the Companies Act, they all create legal structures for the running and operation of those entities and the governance of those entities. And at the helm of that pyramid, or in the middle, if we're to listen to Professor Garrett, sits the board of directors. So the boards are appointed with specific purposes and mandates. They must oversee the governance of these entities. And our topic is onboarding and induction. So having selected people who we hope are competent, and in Jamaica, our government has now mandated a database from which persons can be drawn, but certainly as part of policy and what is happening already today in Jamaica, there has to be a board competency profile for each board, which sets out what are the particular skill sets that are required for persons to be directors on those boards. So having successfully appointed your directors, then obviously the very next thing is that then these directors have to be properly inducted. Now, diversity is a big issue. And with diversity, one of the elements we have here in Jamaica is youth. So there is now an effort to bring persons who qualify as youth, which is 29 and under, onto our boards as part of our thrust for diversity. And certainly the gender, it has to be 30% of each sex. And as mentioned before, you will want persons with diverse skill sets and persons who have the skill sets that a particular board needs. But very often these persons don't have a clue necessarily about the requirements of governance. They may be skilled in their particular area, but they don't know what their fiduciary responsibilities are. And so to me, one of the first things that we have got to do and have got to ensure is that for all these people that we ask to serve, that there is proper onboarding. Otherwise, it's not fair to them, and it's certainly not fair to us as the citizens of the country. So the onboarding process is absolutely critical. And over the period of this conference, some of the things have come up as to What are the sorts of things that we need to talk to our new directors about? And certainly we know that we have to explain to them the laws. We have to explain to them their fiduciary responsibilities. And we have to explain these things in ways that they understand it. We have to explain to them what is a conflict of interest, what is a conflict of duty, what does it mean when you are named an independent director because the audit committee requires that there be a certain number of independent directors. These are things that the directors will have to understand. And I was asked once by Camilla why it is that Jamaica went so far and had like our Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, because it is that law that says that those fiduciary responsibilities that we find under the Companies Act also apply in the public sector. And the last panel, it was agreed that even though in Trinidad you don't have a similar law, the common law imports all those duties. So all the duties that we see, the duties of loyalty, all of what we call the fiduciary responsibilities, as well as the duty of care, those apply in Trinidad as much as they do in Jamaica. But why did we have the legislation? So I went back, Camilla, and I checked on that. And it came out of both the financial sector crisis and the fact that a lot of public sector entities were shouldering the government with huge debt obligations. And there was concern as to whether these entities were being properly run. And so the government, in attempting to deal with this issue, said, okay, we need a law that ensures that the public sector it's run in a particular way where it has good governance, good management capabilities. And so the law was passed that said that you have to govern public sector entities in particular ways. So that is how Jamaica got to this point. And flowing from the corporate governance, from the PBMA, the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, came our corporate governance framework for public bodies, which went further to explain some of the duties, explain some of the responsibilities. So when we say, okay, you set the tone at the top, what does that mean? You're setting the tone at the top. It must include that you're going to say that in this entity, we don't tolerate sexual harassment. We sit as a board and we say we don't tolerate corruption. And we then put in place appropriate policies that will ensure that management can then follow that lead so that the organization on a whole will be the type of organization that as the board, we have set the tone for. Now, the whole purpose of governance is to ensure that the organization is directed and controlled in the ways that the board has established or decided that this is the nature and the type of the organization that we want. When it comes now to having new persons come in, they come in and they don't have that orientation. And if it is that we do not at the outset say, these are our values, these are our policies, this is who we are, this is how we operate, then you're going to end up having persons who come in and through no fault of their own may not even be aware. You'll have persons come in and not understand the difference between the role of the board and the role of management. You don't just learn that by yourself. Somebody has to sit down and explain that to you. And so there is, to my mind, no doubt that a critical success factor for the state-owned enterprises is the orientation and the induction that you give to new board members. I will stop at this point so others can share their early thoughts.
I have a whole list of questions for you, Camille, particularly around that last point about it, orientation being a critical success factor. But let me invite Bernard to make his contribution, and then Ronnie. But thank you so much, Camille. Very thought provoking as always.
Thank
Bernard.
you, Joanne. Thank you, first of all, Pamela, for giving me the opportunity to present at this conference. And like the other presenters, I have to indicate that it has been rather insightful just listening to the previous presentations and so on. So, in terms of my contribution on this particular issue, let me just first of all indicate that what I'm going to say is not unique to any political administration. But I want to start with what Dr. Farrell shared with us this morning when he said that being a director is risky, it's onerous, and it's short. And I have to agree with the risky because after the advent of UTT, E-Tech, and Petrochin, yes, it has become rather risky depending on what the organization find themselves in. It could be short because sometimes it's 2 years, 3 year tenure. And then he said it could be onerous. And I have to say that could be a mood discussion in that not every director who comes on a board is there to really work for the organization. And certainly, if I am faced with a situation where I'm charged with providing onboarding and induction, I would ask that director, why are you here? And having lived in the belly of the beast for the last 20 years, generally I find that directors come on boards for 4 reasons. Some of them come for the status, so they could tell their friends and family and so on that, I'm on the board and so company. Some of them come for the stipend. And even though, yes, it's paltry in some of our eyes, so some of them it's significant. So they're there for the stipend. Some of them come to self actualize, right? They've never been at the helm of an organization. So this is an opportunity to exercise power. And some of them come to really serve. And it's only when you come to really serve it can be onerous because being a good director is a demanding role. And just to treat with the delta, as I wouldn't just repeat what Camille would have shared with us earlier. So I'm going to skip over some of those things. But in terms of the onboarding and induction, certainly in my experience, the three most critical attributes of a director are courage, honesty, and fairness. And I'm not so sure that any onboarding or induction program could get people to make those adjustments. They have to do that for themselves. Critical in the role of being a director in joining a board, it makes a difference whether you're a ordinary director or whether you're the chairman or deputy chairman. Because if you're in the role of chairman, we have to appreciate that's a pivotal role. And there are certain demands that are placed on you as against an ordinary member of the board, right? You are responsible for the culture of that board. And critical in the culture of that board is the decision-making process. I've served on boards or been reporting to boards where it's a case of no bloody dog bark when the chairman makes a decision. Everybody listen up and he runs his show and everybody falls in line.
Mhm.
That's the reality in some cases, right? But in general, the onboarding process is owned by the chairman, which he may or may not delegate to the corporate secretary or the CEO president of the organization. So depending on what your purpose is, depending on what is your driver for being on that board, you can make a difference as far as being exposed to onboarding and induction, or it may not make any difference at all. Right? So Sydney, speaking from the Trinidad and Tobago context, right? You're appointed to a board. Let's be clear, you're a political appointee. And fundamental in that is the type of briefing you get from the minister. In a number of cases, the minister would brief the board before they assume the role. And the words of the minister are so fundamental. I've been privy to experiences where the minister would say, you know, it's because of my party you're in here, you know, so, you know, fall in line, right? There was one minister who came and said, you see this thing, this state enterprise performance manual, that's just a guide, you know, you don't have to really live up to that, right? But there are those who felt that the role of the organization was critical to national development or economic activity and so on. So you had what I would call judicious and prudent guidance, but that is not the case in every instance, right? So if you were to assume, as Camille made reference, that your board is diverse, it's cross-skilled in terms of gender, age, ethnicity in some instances, right? The expertise that comes onto the board. Let's use that as our backdrop. Let's assume that we have a competent chairman who allows, you know, the individuals to be themselves and to speak openly and freely, have open discussion. And then we talk about the type of culture we want to create on that board. And certainly for me, in my experience, there are certain values that must inform that culture. If that organization is to perform well and to really live up to its mandate or charter. And those board values are integrity, independence, accountability, transparency, and mutual respect. Those are the five that I would say are non-negotiable for those who are really interested in doing a stellar job of being a director, right? So as you would have heard this morning, in some cases, people are selected based on loyalty rather than their ability. So let's make the assumption that everybody is there to do the best job, right? The understand that it's really about corporate governance and not political governance, right? And that there's the appreciation that you need to act in the best interest of the organization and that you're using public funds in the execution of your duties. So the process starts really, right? And I've lived through some of these. You have an introduction to other board members, the committee chairman, if the committee is already selected, the leadership of the organization, and the key stakeholders of the organization, right? Be it key customers, the external auditors, and then to make sure that there is some degree of um, coming together. You have both informal and formal sessions among the members. In joining the organization, you need to get an appreciation of whether the company has a charter or what their mandate is. Some companies have a director's manual, which you need to get access to. You need to understand the structure of the board because certainly in some cases, you have joint venture arrangements. If you look at PowerGen, there are a number of shareholders, but it's still considered a sort of quasi-state enterprise. If you look at TSTT, you have external investors. So you need to get an appreciation of the structure of the board, the committees, whether you have independents or the representatives from those other shareholders. All right, we spoke a lot about company laws, articles of association, right? Some companies have corporate governance policies, right? Or code of ethics which guides how they are to behave. I will still make mention of the State Enterprise Performance Monitoring Manual, which is, you know, a good guide in terms of what is required and what are the compliance requirements of the organization. Joining any organization, you will not have time to read all the different policies of the organization, but it would be useful to get a listing of all the companies that inform behaviors and processes and procedures within the organization. I would get at least 6 months of previous board committee minutes, board and committee minutes, and certainly the monthly reports of the organization. All the committees of the organization, of the board, the subcommittees, whether it's tender, audit, and so on, they would have charters. It would be useful to get those. To be aware of some of the exposures of the organization, right? You would want to get an appreciation of the Procurement Act, our OSH Act, our EMA Act, depending on the nature of the business that the company is in. You'd also want to get a feel for some of the media releases of the organization and what people are saying about the organization, whether they have a Facebook page or Instagram and so on. All these things inform what you are getting into when you join the organization. From a more formal setting, you want to get an appreciation of the strategic direction of the organization. So do they have a strategic plan? Does it provide an industry overview, an assessment of your competitors, the mandate and purpose of the organization, the mission, the vision, the values? Fundamental things if you're to operate effectively as a director. Do they have an operating or business plan for the current year? Right? What is the information you can glean from the monthly reports of this organization? Do they have other plans? Because depending on what committee you're on, you might have to get access to their marketing plan, their ICT plan, their audit plan, right? The annual reports, right? We hear people talking about some state enterprises not having annual reports, 5 years, 6 years. I've faced this myself. And really, it comes back to the board of directors' responsibility to get these things done. If you're in the HR committee, or just from your general information, you want the latest employee surveys that have been conducted, right? Do we have customer survey reports? Do you have an enterprise risk assessment and mitigation plan for the organization? Is there recent evaluation of the executive team and a succession plan? And certainly you'd want presentations from the leadership of the organization to get an appreciation of the key issues, the challenges, how they see the board being able to assist the management in executing the mandate of the organization. It would be important, I would say, to get a profile of the other directors, right? The committees you're assigned to, the schedule of meetings, the key processes for the receipt of documentation. You're on the board, how do we get board reports or submissions for consideration by committees? Is it all electronic? Is it hard copy, right? What are the protocols for receiving information that is missing? Do you engage the CEO? Do you engage the staff? Do you go through the corporate secretary? All these are standard processes that need to be established within the organization so that directors feel comfortable and they are clear in terms of what approaches they should be taking. And then, of course, the dynamics in the boardroom. Are you expected to be a rubber stamper, or are you allowed to give your feedback and your views independently? How are you going to be measured in terms of your performance on this board, right? And yes, we spoke about stipend, but there might be some other benefits that would accrue to the individual. And then, of course, formal training is required. We don't make the assumption that the person understands corporate governance. It's an evolving dynamic area. So of course, I would ensure that there is some corporate governance training. There's leadership training, because being a director is a leadership role. You have to make sure you have business acumen, the communications competency, your ability to mentor, good people skills, right? All the competencies that accrue to a leadership role, especially at the executive level, must be acquired by an effective director. And of course, if you're operating within a team, it would be incumbent on the chairman to arrange some teamwork training or sessions for the directors themselves, and possibly to extend that to the leadership of the organization to work with the directors so that you have a cohesive team that would augur well for the organization if they work well together. So being on the board, you have to own your experience, right? Don't allow others to dictate how you should be, right? Understanding your role, your responsibilities, right? We made mention of the issue of it's an oversight role as against being an operating role. Don't get involved in the business of management, right? Which we see all too often. Understand the distinction between politics versus business. Understand the business of the organization. One of the things that new directors might have to be exposed to is training on how a corporation works, because some of them may have operated at low levels or not have any experience operating at the highest level in organization. So just basic training on what are the dynamics of operating and managing an organization. Knowing your liabilities, but also knowing your gaps. What are your shortcomings? You're on the finance committee, but you don't know how to read a balance sheet or a P&L, right? it's incumbent on you to either ask for that training or get it yourself, right? Because not being aware could inform inappropriate decisions, which create additional exposure for you as a director, right? In the business of being a director, you have to protect your professional and personal reputation. We've seen that being stripped from some people depending on some of the decisions made by organization. I have a term here called become appropriately integrated into the board. You get on a board and you see that some people have, for want of a better term, clandestine agendas, right? You may not have evidence, but you have information. So you need to behave appropriately. Let's put it that way, right? Be honest, be fair, act with integrity, act with courage. There are going to be some requests made, as Dr. Farrell pointed out this morning, that are inappropriate. And you have to be prepared to ignore or walk away, right? Some people find that the cost of walking away is too much and get involved in shenanigans, which turn out to be not in their best interest in the long term, right? So the onerous part is make sure you're prepared for your board meetings and your committee meetings. You get your papers, you read them before, you identify the issues, right? You want to show up. Try and attempt to attend all your board meetings and be an active participant in the deliberations and decision making, right? That is what is required of an effective director. You may want to visit some of the locations where the company operates just to get a feel for the business of the company. Right? You might want to see some of their processes in action. It helps you in your contextualizing of the issues before you and also in decision making. And don't be scared to get support from outside. Right? You might need support from the management team to provide additional knowledge, perspective, guidance. Don't be too proud. Don't let the ego determine the type of information you seek, right? Exercise some humility in instances where you are quite aware that you're not up to standard. And certainly from my personal view, if you have no intention of doing a good job, you really should leave. Let me end by saying that I have a particular hypothesis where state-owned enterprises are concerned. And my hypothesis is this, that the political class has undermined the professional class, and the professional class has not had the courage to stand up to the political class because basically we have the mortgage, we have the children going to school, we have the additional bills, and those things are more important, and it informs the decision of the political class, the
Professional.
professional class. They abide by the dictates of the political class. So that's my hypothesis, and that's where I'll end it for the time being, John.
Well, Bernard, to say you've blown my mind doesn't begin to describe it, because I was actually trying to feverishly keep notes, and I got to 43 things that you mentioned, and none of them can I say is. I went through it and I thought, no, there's none that I can say I could skip. None. And you try to prioritize lists and say, let me get to the top 6. That's just impossible. So thank you so much.
Welcome.
Ronnie, I'm so glad it's you following Bernard and not me. But I know you're up to the challenge, Ronnie. I know. I've heard you speak. So let me leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joanne. And as Bernard was speaking, I remember I first met Bernard, I believe, in 1996. I was a director of TSTT, and he was a very senior executive at TSTT, and he's even more persuasive now than he was then. So it really was a learning experience, and of course, Camille before him. In relation to our topic, I thought a little bit about it, and I just wanted to offer perhaps a slightly different perspective, because I think it is necessary for directors who are being invited to become members of state boards or statutory agencies on Trinidad and Tobago, and in fact, in the Commonwealth, Caribbean, should be aware of what our expectations are, and perhaps more importantly, what the legal exposure and what they can demand of those who appoint them. I think it is now generally accepted that directors of state boards in Trinidad and Tobago are governed principally by sections 60B and 99, 1 and 2 of the Companies Act, and of course by the Code of Conduct in the Integrity in Public Life Act, chapter 2201. That code and the provisions in the Companies Act really underscore and require directors as persons in public life to act honestly, prudently, and in good faith in the best interests of the SOE that they serve. Significantly, these duties are owed not to the cabinet, corporation sole, that's to say the Minister of Finance, the line minister, or even their fellow directors. They are owed to the SOE. Very significant. And I wanted to just draw our attention to that point. And of course, in determining what is in the best interest of the SOE that I serve, a director is required by sections 99, 1 and 2 of the Companies Act to take into account principally the interest of its shareholders and employees. Now, but these interests are not exhaustive, and a prudent director, I think we can agree, has a fiduciary obligation to consider, among other things, the public interest, environmental conditions, compliance, legal regulatory requirements. And not only that, but should frame his or her decision and as not being grounded in the short term, which might be 1 or 2 years, or even the political term or the political cycle, which is 5 years, but the medium and the long term. Of course, in the long term, we are all dead, but be that as it may, we should look beyond our next renewal appointment in 3 years and perhaps consider that there is life after politics. All of that is important because the courts in the Commonwealth Caribbean, as it relates to Companies Acts and in particular the fiduciary duties of directors, and bearing in mind that our Companies Acts, and this is throughout the Commonwealth Caribbean, are based on the Canadian legislation, not the UK legislation. And they all legislations between 1993 to about 1999. So during that 24-year period or more, we have in fact a gestation where we have developed our own jurisprudence as it relates to companies, the roles of the directors, and importantly, how these directors' duties are regarded. And the courts have underscored that the employees and the shareholders' interests are divergent. This is because an employee is primarily interested in job security and enhanced employment benefits, while of course the shareholders' principal concern is to increase the capital value of the share. So the question that arises for a newly inducted director, how does a prudent SOE director reconcile these competing interests in determining what is in the best interest of the SOE that he serves? A good example, perhaps a fresh one, is CAL, which recently, as you know, has made a certain public statements about retrenchment of a large swathe of its workforce. Now, CAL is not a customary or typical SOE, but it is now completely reliant on the government for financial support. And in that sense, it is no different from any other SOE. This means that its board of directors, in deciding to retrench so much of its workforce, would properly have balanced the financial benefits to CAL of a leaner, less expensive workforce against the costs of the retrenchment exercise and the commensurate loss of many highly competent and loyal employees in a specialized industry who they may have to re-employ when aviation prospects improve. Is contemplated, this is in 2024 to 2025, or thereabouts. Happily for most state directors, however, they do not need to make such hard choices because both the SOE and corporation sole, as shareholder, are generally interested in the same thing, the profit motive, in other words, the bottom line. Having said that, we are very much alive to the fact that the recent WASA debacle, where the company reversed its decision to disconnect thousands of heavily indebted consumers because of the optics. And remember, we know what the optics are, hardships in a COVID-19 pandemic, but of course the political considerations. And both of them demonstrates just how little autonomy many state boards actually enjoy as the reversal instruction came from the line minister, no doubt with the authority of cabinet. The problem, therefore, is that while Corporation Sole is the shareholder of WASA, and in fact it appointed its WASA's Board of Commissioners, the board, upon the appointment, is now supposed to be in control, not the shareholder. In addition to the shareholders' interests and the employees' welfare, which, as we know, are the two principal considerations, a prudent SOE director is also statutorily required to consider all material factors. And in my respectful view, this means that in making and taking business decisions, prudency requires a consideration of corporate risk. Now, I think it's very important that someone, that the newly appointed director is apprised as to what is meant by the expression risk. Many of us, when we hear the word risk, think of it from an insurance point of view. In other words, the risks of a particular peril occurring and the cost of obtaining of suitable insurance. But risk, as in a corporate governance perspective, is much more. Risk assessment, for instance, is a key role, and that is underscored in the Ministry of Finance's State Enterprises Performance Monitoring Manual, which is a 2011 iteration. That's the same manual that Bernard referred to. That manual, however, unlike the legislation, that means the Companies Act and the Integrity in Public Life Act, the manual is merely a guide, and in fact, most state directors are given copies of the 427-page manual and invited. Well, I'm not sure if they are invited to, but I doubt very much of it is read. And that is a source of grave concern, because it is a matter of public record that High Court claims have been brought against SOE directors by the very same state agencies that they once served. These claims generally allege very serious breaches of fiduciary duties. And it is speculated, I don't know, but it is speculated that many of these claims are politically motivated when there's a change in administration. All of those things really interferes with and interrupts business continuity. But it is principally because of the risks of litigation and the risk of litigation exposure, in my humble view, that many civic-minded and responsible citizens do not offer themselves for public service. They are also afraid of being politically associated with the government that appoints them, or of the possibility of grave and irreparable damage to hard-earned professional and personal reputations because of board failings which they are not in control of. And we need to tackle that point, because it means that unless, of course, the pool is widened and deepened, the caliber of the appointees are not likely to improve. And I was very interested to hear Bernard's fourfold analysis as to what drives a director to an appointment. And I think the only one he left out would be the possibility of getting those free carnival tickets that so many of them covet. But be that as it may, we must also underscore that in Trinidad and Tobago, and in fact throughout the Commonwealth, we have now moved in terms of SOE accountability from principle to rule-based corporate governance. And that notion of rule-based corporate governance is very much alive. In fact, that is what the Integrity in Public Life tells us. And it's the only piece of legislation that defines what integrity is, or rather, through the conflict of positions, what it ought not to be. So it seems, therefore, that in Trinidad and Tobago, and I dare say in the Commonwealth Caribbean, we have abandoned principle-based for rule-based corporate governance. And what is significant about that is that it means, in effect, that for many new or newly intended or newly inducted directors, that they must be alive to the fact that there are, in fact, thresholds that they must be measured against. In the United States, for instance, corporate governance is increasingly enforced by the rule of law, and many of us are familiar with the federal and regulatory laws and which have been reinforced by the SEC. That, however, must be contrasted with the situation in the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, even India, Malaysia, and New Zealand, where the principle-based model still takes priority. And corporate governance is often based on discretionary codes and best practices and protocols. both competing systems, that is to say, principle as against rule-based systems, have not converged. Although I know many authoritative commentators believe that there is a convergence, or will be, if only because we all covet American finance. And therefore we must, in fact, then model our behavior on a rule base, so the American system. The fact, however, that there have been, at least in Trinidad and Tobago, very few prosecutions and perhaps even fewer convictions for breaches of the integrity legislation suggests to me that the latter, that is to say, the integrity legislation, has become a box-ticking exercise, so that the typical SOE director satisfies the reporting requirements simply by his annual integrity filings, and is generally not at grave risk of investigation and prosecution for insider trading, conflict of interest, insider dealing, obtaining secret profits, bribery, corruption, nepotism, all of that. It is likely, however, and this is a source of much comfort, that a future SOE director, having regard to the new procurement legislation and perhaps even the whistleblowing legislation, may become more publicly accountable, but that remains to be seen. That fabric is important in terms of the what is to be woven into the induction training. My experience is that most SOE directors do not read the manual, and even if they do, there is very little by way of induction training to answer questions or address concerns, particularly as it relates to their fiduciary duties and corporate risks. The code itself, very gamely at page 10 of the 2011 iteration, reminds directors that they are required to familiarize themselves with the bylaws of the company, refrain from conflict of interest situations. They're required to support the management of the company while maintaining operational oversight. They are required to approve the strategic plan for the business and even develop a risk analysis and mitigation strategy for the company. All excellent, all first world thinking. I am also reminded that part 2.4 of when I say the CCGI, or Trinidad and Tobago Corporate Governance Code, which was devised by the CCGI in conjunction with the Stock Exchange and the Chamber of Commerce in 2013, states that all directors should receive induction training upon joining the board and should regularly update and refresh their skills and knowledge. The aim is to offer new directors with the tools, resources, information, material to help them appreciate the SOE, the environment in which it functions, and their role in making it a success. Both Camille and Bernard spoke about getting your directors used to the landscape. And while that code and 2.4 is specifically referable to public companies, of course, I think we can all agree that it should apply to SOE directors. In fact, there is now an increasing trend, a happy trend for many companies like CCGI, for SOEs to work with governance professionals to provide dedicated training for directors. In many cases, however, and this is a matter of some regret, the training is generic. It's usually based on the UK model of governance, which fails to take into account our company's legislation being Canadian-driven. In fact, many of the training does not take into account the idiosyncrasies of our state sector, where the cabinet and the line minister, rather than the board of directors, determine the strategic direction and mandate of the company, and that some business decisions are motivated by political aspirations rather than, being consistent with the SOE's mandate. And what that means and what that says to me and what I'm suggesting is that state boards should avoid what I call off-the-shelf induction training, which too often is a cut and paste of what is offered for directors in private enterprise. It also means that because of the idiosyncratic elements that I've referred to, that it is of very little purpose or use to invite commentators whose training is really North American or even European to come and speak to us here about management and the role of the board in a state enterprise or in a state context, which does not appreciate that defining responsibilities from a cabinet or a line minister is perhaps more important, because the customary shareholder perspective, where of course the shareholders appoint the board of directors, just does not apply. Further, I think, and this again is a personal view, the training should reflect for the most of the SOEs that its source of revenues is the public purse, and that the usual economic theories of demand and supply do not apply. it should also speak to the monolithic service industries, where we are familiar with these monopolies and the absence of competition and regulatory oversight, all of which has a role in terms of what is required of our directors. Another thing that I think should be mandatory in the training is to invite self-assessments or evaluations. And I think we can all agree that evaluations are a very powerful tool for sensitizing state boards to the link between corporate governance and performance. And I think equally, we'll all agree that these evaluations should be board-driven and need not require external oversight, but be a key indicator to the government as to competencies of its directors. And those should drive the recruitment and renewal process rather than the customary loyalty to the government. Having said that, there is no SOE in my experience which has a functioning nominations or governance committee. And I would love to be told I'm wrong about that. But there is none in my experience which has a functioning nominations and governance committee which makes recommendations for the appointment of future directors. And it seems to me that its absence is a very plain demonstration that governments generally are less concerned with competencies than it is with rewarding party loyalty. The converse is also true. It means that it is essential that the newly inducted state board directors are encouraged to take action and report any undue pressures from politicians or anyone else for that matter, so as to insulate the board from overt political interference in commercial decision-making. Thus, there should be more complaint mechanisms which can be established to safeguard the independence of the SOE, to reduce the scope of discretionary influences, and bring in greater clarity to the role of the director. Perhaps you may agree with me that the chair has a major role to play in protecting his board from overt executive influence, while at the same time, and this is a very delicate balance, while at the same time taking policy directives from the line minister, who of course speaks for cabinet. The best chairs of state bodies are of course those who understand that very sensitive balancing exercise and who are alive to it. And while listening carefully and no doubt condescendingly to the line minister, is able to speak very authoritatively about the independence and autonomy of the board and the chair. Whether that is in fact happening, no doubt will be driven by the recruitment process. But be that as it may, that is really what you want from your chair, not necessarily party loyalty. Of course, it's a bonus if your party loyalist is also extremely competent. We also have to deal with, as part of the induction process, about this whole notion of select committee oversight. All of us are familiar with the optics associated with state enterprises and their directors and CEOs being grilled by select committees in Parliament. And while that encourages very sensationalist headlines and riveting storylines, it does very little, in my respectful view, to ensure sustainable transparency and accountability. And this is not helped by the very periodic reports of the Auditor General, issued so many years after the financial impropriety occurs, that generally nothing is done to improve financial systems. It must therefore be part of that induction and onboarding process for a director to appreciate that while I'm a director of a state enterprise, as part of that directorship, I am required to attend and actually address and provide assistance to the select committees. And my loyalty is to the company that appoints me and to the process of oversight, not to the line minister, of course, to the cabinet. Having said all of that, we are aware that under the Exchequer and the Audit Act, Chapter 6901, the Minister of Finance or Corporation sole is responsible for investigating the financial performance of all SOEs. This has been very sporadically used, and when activated is generally directed to the governance of the previous administration. In other words, it is not used, or it's not generally used as a means for investigation to provide authoritative, decisions as to what caused an event, but really as an attack on a previous administration. We are reminded that the OECD guidelines on corporate governance of state-owned enterprises, which came out in 2015, aims to improve corporate governance in public companies, and perhaps in a utopia, invites boards to assess and review their corporate strategy, develop and oversee the effectiveness of risk management policies and procedures, talks about labor, environmental, tax-related issues, and all of those things. And in fact, encourages periodic board reviews as well. So there's no shortage of material out there as to what really we require and what we need to do, and to make almost mandatory in terms of the onboarding process. But I think in summarizing it, the process that should be used would encourage the board to be more vigilant by crafting a system of checks and balances to guarantee that there is an ethical environment where there is no or very little abuse of power, and that all decisions are made in the SOE and ipso facto, the nation's best interest. That means that there must be a sustainable evaluation of board performance. And that means that we must police ourselves as directors, as well as, of course, having a very active internal audit engagement, and perhaps more importantly, a functioning audit and finance committee with regular external auditing. The intent, I think, is to encourage the board to improve its appetite for openness and transparency, to remove persons who are corrupt, and to strengthen the procedures and systems to increase public accountability. SOEs, as part of that onboarding experience, should, with board support, and I underscore board support, attract qualified and talented employees who are rewarded with performance-based bonuses, and who are conversely removed for chronic underperformance, or where they are unable to establish a professionally competitive work culture to improve the company's efficiencies and profitability. Finally, it is essential that the government appoint, and again, this is my view and not the view of the CCGI, it's a personal view. It is essential that the government appoint competent, professional, and independent members to the SOE's board of directors. I know that's a fairly provocative statement, but I do believe that it can be implemented by establishing a national non-partisan board selection committee, a BSC, which comprises perhaps of members of government, opposition, even private sector, the independent Senate, persons who on the face of it are prepared to offer themselves for public service and are not partisan. Having said that, we are all alive to the system which rewards trusted and loyal political operatives with plum chairmanship and directors' positions. This political culture is not likely to change unless the appointment system is recalibrated to improve diversity, including, and I offer this as a view, a greater application and appreciation for politically neutral directors. I'm careful not to say independent directors, but politically neutral directors, very much like our system of independent senators, which seems to work. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your for hearing me out. I wish to thank Ms. Alicia Manarika and Ms. Ariana Prambucharan, both of them from my chambers, who assisted me with this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. Now, my job's supposed to be easy, but let me say, I gave up trying to keep up with the notes, with the points that you were raising as you were spitting them out. There was just so much there to talk about. Thank you so much for that insight. Can I invite the panelists, now that they've heard each other speak, to actually initially respond? Camille, I must say, I'm going to choose moderator's authority here and ask you particularly to pick up on the point in your response to Bernard and to Ronnie, but particularly Ronnie's point about that last suggestion about appointing politically neutral persons and the whole process that Jamaica experienced with regard to making the selection, assessment, and appointment to boards independent of the political, to take it out of political reach. And has it worked?
Yes, I'm happy to. But first of all, I have to bring to the fore a deep inequity that has now come to my attention. We do not get carnival tickets in Jamaica. We don't even get our independence tickets. And this has got to be addressed as a matter of priority, because clearly, because, you know, who said that now? The whole matter of the appointment being politically neutral, what we have done is the Ministry of Finance in 2018 issued a selection and nomination policy. And that policy sets out how it is that directors are to be selected. And it embeds the fact that they have to have certain competencies, that they have to have the time to do the job, and all the good things that we have been talking about. And that policy now is about to become legislation. And in that legislation, it deals with the diversity. It deals with the fact that at the end of life of every board, say on the change of an administration, 1/3 of the board members have to be carried forward to the next board. So hopefully we are really working very hard to lift the whole professionalism of the board and to push back from the whole political arena. And I will tell you my own story. When I was appointed to the NSWMA, which was one of at the time, you know, there were many challenges. My husband, who I did not feel thoroughly consulted about my decision before I made it, and that was because of the timing, told me he was no longer going to go out with me in public because of the whole situation where, you know, you are now looked at as being politically aligned. So I was first appointed in 2015 under the PNP and then reappointed in 2016 under the JLP, and I have been there ever since. Similarly, our chairman and other members of the board. So we are really trying to professionalize, not that we didn't have some professionals before, but take some of the politics out of the appointments. The database is populated by persons who have been hopefully trained, where a lot of us are drawn now from the private sector. And the government has recently indicated that they're going to advertise for persons who are interested so they can apply to be included in the database from which we draw directors. And there were so many things, especially, well, I agree with everything Ronnie said about the law and not having generic training and the self-evaluation, that is mandatory. Sorry, the board evaluation, that is definitely mandatory in Jamaica, no. And there, Bernard, no. Oh, we'll have to come back to a lot of Bernard's comments, but let me give somebody else a chance.
Yes, oh, Bernard. A lot of meat for you to respond to.
So my position with respect to the point you're making there about having people who are not aligned or non-aligned individuals, right, being appointed to board. Certainly in our experience, that is almost utopian, because we know that to some extent, the whole issue of board appointments is used as a sort of political reward system. And what essentially they'll be doing is giving up, you know, that opportunity to reward those who feel would have contributed to the ability to gain political power. So I'm not so, you know, my real issue is we know what the right things are. We know what is required. It's not that we don't know. We all know what is required to make these things perform better. We know what is required in terms of selecting board appointments and so on. We all are quite aware. The question is, why aren't we doing it? And I think to a large extent, it's about what we are giving up. We are not prepared to give up certain things. So we maintain and we continue with the old systems that we have. And actually, we might be heading further. We might be destroying value, as it were, as far as, you know, things like board appointments and the performance of our SOEs. Yeah, that is my position.
Okay. Ronnie, based on your what you heard from Camille and from Bernard, I'm particularly taken with Bernard's 43 things that I can't eliminate any of the list from in terms of how to prepare for being on a board.
Many things came out, and I'm very grateful to Bernard for his very incisive presentation, of course. If I can juxtapose what Bernard was said with what Terence said this morning about board appointments being risky, onerous, and short. You know, I think it's a very pithy statement, but absolutely accurate, because the risks that we have spoken about, the risks are, speaking of exposure, damage to personal and professional reputations, and other things that we are not in control of. Onerous from the point of view that we are, for many of us, particularly newly inducted directors, unused to the fact of being at the helm, and unless we are very well trained, it's difficult to to not descend into the political operations and try to operate at that level. And Short, is it nasty, brutish, and short? As who was it? Who was a philosopher? Is it 1689? Was it? I'm sorry, I'm just trying to remember.
Wasn't it Hobbes?
Hobbes, I think it's Hobbes.
Thank
So
you.
we can now substitute the Farrell's equation of risky, onerous, and short with nasty, brutish, and short. But the short, I think, is for me the most important, because what is worrisome is that unless we can align the economic cycle with the political cycle, and Kondratiev would be turning in his grave by that. It means, in effect, that there's no way that a director will be able to fully understand and appreciate his role, understand the organization, and still be in a position to do something that's meaningful, that has legacy significance in the 3 or 4 years that he or she is appointed. And therefore, it means that for most directors, they simply want to enjoy something of what they have, try to make a contribution, and be prepared to be taken off the board after 4 years. So it does not encourage medium and long-term thinking, because my term is a fairly short one. And I'm very much persuaded that the Jamaican model, and I'm very happy to hear Camille say that it's going to be legislative. If we can even come close to that, it will really make it much easier to ensure longevity in our directors and continuity, in terms of the change outs after administration changes. Yes.
Okay. Before I throw it open to pick up any questions, I don't know, Camille, if there are any questions that anyone's after. I think the chat has been stunned into silence, quite frankly. One of the things I would want to touch on, Ronnie, just picking up, you introduced us to this dichotomy, these two ways of approaching governance, your governance code, whether it's principle-based, whether it's
rule-based.
Rule-based.
Yes.
And that I heard you say your sense is that we're moving from principles to rules. And my challenge is I would love to be principles, but principles presume that we're all coming to it from the same value system.
Right.
And I wondered if what we're seeing is this signal that we are really not embracing the same value system to drive our interpretation of those principles. So the next way of approaching it, at least initially, is to introduce rules, which inevitably mean, in my reading, that rule-based systems are effective when everybody's facing the same sorts of situations and challenges. So it's easy to describe, define, and document. A lot of the principles, a lot of the situations you meet when you're looking at governance and you're dealing with situations in the real world and situations that are arising when you're on a board, really need to have a core set of principles. So how do you think we can actually reverse that trend?
Thank you, Joanne. Well, the reason I think that we are moving or have moved from principle to rule-based is largely because of the Integrity in Public Life Act,
right,
which has a code of conduct at sections 30 to 37, which defines conflict of interest, it defines honesty and other things, and defines integrity. And prior to that, of course, it was generally principle-based, and everything that we have now moving in terms of a rule-based. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, if only because it allows us to measure our performance as whether or not we are over or below the line, the threshold. I think it was the fudginess of the principle-based model, where I know what I have done is right or wrong, but not necessarily others. Then it means that I can still get away with things, even though my conscience may hurt me like hell and I may not be able to sleep at night. The rule-based model encourages an external determination as to whether or not what I did is unlawful or certainly unethical. And to that end, I think, because we are not very good at self-policing, then I think it's necessary to have that mechanism. Having said that, we've only had, I think, 2 convictions under the rule-based legislation. Both of them, I think, were politically driven. So I'm not sure how effective it is to have changed characters and to change conduct in that sense.
Just before I come to you, Camille, I believe Mariano has his hand up. Mariano, would you like to make your contribution?
Yeah, I want to make a contribution on that comment, and I'd like to thank Camille for putting some of the changes that are put on the table in Jamaica that are applicable, that do make sense. And just to add some notes of caution to some of the stuff that has been said before. In the first instance, one of the reasons why we haven't changed our methodology in large way is because there's no push for it to happen. All right. Precisely because of the if you want, the dichotomy between what we consider to be principled and as well as distinct from rules. And quite frankly, I don't think we understand the difference. And having said that, I also want to point out there are a number of occasions on which we would consider say that people of party hacks have been appointed and so on and so forth, which is not necessarily the case. It would appear that in situations where there are companies that have been stressed, there's been a much more sensible approach to such appointments. So, for example, TCL. TCL was a basket, right? It's probably one of the few state enterprises that had a successful transition mechanism away from the state enterprises sector into the public sector, the public list. Right? It's not unique, but it's probably one of the better ones. Right? That is to be contrasted, for example, with the position of National Flour Mills, where I think National Flour Mills unfortunately was used to advance political position. I think one of the directors, if not some of the board, did in fact eventually carry the government to court with respect to their responsibility. So it's not an open and shut case that everybody who is appointed chairman are in fact, how shall we call it, party hacks. Right? You probably will find that it's probably closer to the case where the companies perhaps have less of a full economic significance and or used as policy mechanisms or mechanisms to advance public policy. Right? So the question of adherence or the proximity, if you will, procurement rules will affect those companies which generally operate on behalf of the state as executing agents. And the rules, and they would probably find themselves in a different kettle of fish. The example that would come to mind in that regard, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, would be EFCL, where a former minister was appointed to the board, but at the same token, not only was he appointed to the board, but the same minister that actually raised a number of issues with regard to procurement, which procurement guidelines were being exceeded, and also certain friendly people were exceeding their authority, if you will, or alternatively operating in practice. So appointment of a chairman is not the appoint, even if there may be examples where they may be seen to be close to a particular fraternity, does not necessarily mean that the chairman and or the person who is so appointed will not operate in the interest of either the company and or the individual. Another example for that of one which is a successful transition or close to a successful transition would be the case of FCB, right? Which again is transitioning from what you call it, from what one would consider to be a state enterprise, which really managed by the state. I can tell you as a minister in the Ministry of Finance that at no stage of the game, any of the board's decisions were ever brought into question with regard to who should be lent or who should not, or who you couldn't lend to. In fact, none of that information was ever passed to the Ministry of Finance. The Ministry of Finance, to all intents and purposes, was blind with regard to the board's exercise of its judgment with regard to the lending capacity. However, I will indicate that on one occasion, as Minister of Finance, when I heard that they had a particular advisor, I was minded to send a permanent secretary to the meeting to remind the board to be careful of this engagement. Right?
Can I press you, Mariano, since you've put your hand up, to say, based on the kind of focus for this session, which is induction and onboarding of directors for state enterprises. Now, you've been in some unique situations compared to other members of the panel. What will you say if you had to say the top 3 things that need to be present when you're onboarding someone for a state enterprise board? What would your top 3 be?
Well, the issues, objective plans, in terms of, and also in terms of how procurement has been exercised or will be exercised moving forward in the future, and make certain that there's sufficient, how shall we call it, sufficient policies and practices which can be deemed to be independent, that you enforce them or ensure them. We do have, for example, one example of what I would call a political witch hunt, where a director, the chief operating officer, and the CEO, and one other director out of a board of approximately 12, they've chosen to pursue 4 people, right? 2 of whom weren't on, or 3 of whom weren't on the procurement committee at all. Right. So under what basis? What was the decision to pursue them? Right, since they were not directly responsible for the allocation of contracts. Right. I mean, it's mind-boggling. Right? I mean, I could call the name of the institution, and quite frankly, it has straddled more than one administration. Right. It just turns out that the administration, which one would presume to be friendly, may have a political nuance in terms of pursuing that particular matter. Right. Okay. So in both instances, I would gather, and in fact, in that particular case, after 10 years, it has not even reached case management yet.
I'm aware of that case, Mariana. So if I can just thank you for that contribution, and as we are getting close to 4:30, just allow Camille to respond to something that she wanted to respond in terms of something that Ronnie mentioned, and also to invite our very quiet chat room to pose any questions before we have to close. But thanks very much for that, Mariana. Camille?
Yes, I wanted to say that in Jamaica, we are not just rule-based, because we also have principles. And certainly on the private sector side, our corporate governance code is principles-based. And our corporate governance framework for public bodies, many things are set out there as principles. But I also wanted to come back to some of the things Bernard had said, because he listed, as you said, all those elements. All those elements are indeed an important part of the onboarding process. And it is the responsibility of the corporate secretary, in support of her chairman, to ensure that there is a proper onboarding process that covers all those elements that were mentioned. And we have now mandated that in Jamaica, but that is something that I think can be taken on board wherever you are, that as an entity, you can decide that we will be onboarding our directors in a particular way and ensure that they properly understand all their duties and responsibilities. It also struck me when Bernard said the political class has undermined the professional class. I think that was
so that's a whole panel on its own.
And I think I so understand where he's coming from. And I think in Jamaica, we have really been making a strong push to change that. So at the private sector organization of Jamaica, and I chair their corporate governance committee, we work very closely with government in so many areas, including the establishment of the public sector awards. We are now going to try and roll out a corporate governance index for public bodies, which will measure the compliance of public bodies with the corporate governance framework. We already have had these things in private sector. And so as they're rolled out in private sector, we're bringing them over to the state-owned enterprises.
Okay, let me start wrapping up by inviting each of you to think about, based on the topic that we're covering, which is the induction of directors onto state boards, there may be people listening right now who may, when they open their email inbox tomorrow, receive some sort of communication inviting them to be on this or that state board, or inviting them to give it their due consideration. They've never been on a board before, not in private or public sector. What would you advise them in your wrapping up comments? Please provide them with some advice as to what are the first things that they need to do to properly determine how to respond to such an offer. Bernard, let me start with you.
Okay, well, first of all, let me just thank Mariano for his contribution. I think Mariano is the philosophy that attends the selection of directors for the FCDs and Angosturas and PCLs and so on. And it be also applied to other state enterprises, you know. There is that due consideration of the talent, skills, and requirements for those critical, for want of a better word, organization, right? The RBLs and so on. We need to be doing the same, because I can say categorically, from my own experience, in some cases, the type of individuals that are placed on some of these SOE boards are there primarily based out of loyalty and their contribution is really minimal. They come to the board meeting, they haven't read their papers, right? They don't make a contribution, then they walk back out. So how do we ensure that those types of individuals don't see the light of a boardroom, right? That is my issue. So if we have a particular philosophy and a structure that makes sure that people who are selected to be on boards, let's make that pervasive if we know that what the appropriate formula is. With respect to someone receiving an email saying, hey, you're on that board, my thing is, you had to have a discussion with yourself. First of all, why am I going onto this board? Right? And I want that discussion to be to serve, to do the best job, to seek the interests of the organization, because by seeking the interests of the organization, more than likely you're seeking the interests of the citizens and the country by having that SOE perform at its best, right? So have that discussion with yourself and have the courage, have the honesty and the fairness to do the best job.
Someone put in the chat, or speak to your or speak to your husband.
Yeah, you need to have that discussion with yourself first.
Ronnie, wrap up in some words.
Yeah, I think if I get such an invitation, I would want to firstly find out who is the chair of the organization or the potential chair, and who my other directors are, because obviously there will be a comfort zone if the person who's chair is somebody of unimpeachable integrity, who I feel I can be part of, and of course that applies to the other members of the board. So that would probably, after the self-searching that Bernard speaks of, and assuming I am prepared to go forward, and then the next question will, who will be likely to be the other persons, and that will have a big say in how ultimately I decide.
Any wrap up on just the general session or what you heard today from the other panelists?
Yes, there were many important. Thank Mariano for his very incisive comments based on a practical, the fact that as a minister in the Ministry of Finance, he would have been, brings a very unique perspective. And I accept his point that we ought not to speak in general terms about many, and I do accept that. But having said that, the SOEs is really characterized by its successes, and that generally a well-run SOE is not heard of. We don't hear too much of them. And what really comes out will be the fairly sensational stories associated with some of those, which unfortunately, marks our view as to how those happen. So I think we want to, to adopt an approach which is inquiring, that, we should not just assume that everything is okay. We should improve or encourage our directors to be a little more, perhaps a little more inquiring as to what is going on around them, and not to become detached. And by all means, I think we should finally, and perhaps most importantly, and I certainly picked this up from both Camille and from Bernard, that we really need directors who are prepared to work. We all are aware of boards where the 2 or 3 directors sit in the corner and probably just enjoy the biscuits and don't really do what is required of them. And that's fine. Most chairs would encourage that, because it allows me to have a kitchen board and I can just persuade 4 members and forget about the other 3. But those other 3 are really not doing themselves any service, and they're certainly not serving their company and their community. So I think we want to encourage inclusiveness as part of that whole process of the induction and training. So, yes.
Thank you, Ronnie. Camille?
Yes, so I think one of the first things you have to ask yourself is, do you have the time?
Can you? I'm hardly hearing you, Camille. I don't know if it's at my end or your end.
No. Okay, are you hearing me better?
Yes, you are. I am.
So I think one of the first things you have to ask yourself is, do you have the time? Do you have the time to commit to do this job? And the courage was mentioned earlier. If you're going there to be a rubber stamper, then it's best you not come along. And then lastly, I would say that I never leave my personal wealth or my reputation in the hands of anyone else.
Yes.
So do you have the willingness to learn what you need to learn, so that if later on you are called to answer for what you have done, you are in a strong position to say, this is what I did, this is why I did it, and it is sound in law or in practice. So those are some of the things you have to think about. And certainly the induction is critical for somebody who has never done this before.
Okay. I'm seeing we're having a lively chat session here. I mean, I would add from a personal perspective that that issue that you have, that discussion that you have with yourself, Bernard, is partly has got to be informed by something that Camille has just suggested. Do you have the time? And I like Ronnie's idea with regard, which is really what happens, is that you quickly look up if they're on the internet. Who were the people on this board? I mean, firstly, you do wonder why me, right? And then you start to say, do you have the time? Do you look at the other people on the board? Do you know them? Initially, if it's the first time it's happened to you, you have to get over yourself first. You have to get over the ego trip it tends to take you down, to come back, to realize that actually when you do start to look at what is required and what could be at risk. Because I mean, I know persons who are part of the example that Mariano mentioned without mentioning the name of the organization, who because of that happening to them, they have a very good contribution to make, but nobody could possibly mention to them ever being on a state board again. They have actually been scarred for life from that experience. They will assist, they will advise you if you're on it, but they're never going to go forward to be on a state board again after what they experienced there. So for those who are listening who have not been on boards before, research. This is not an ego trip. It's an ego trip that could be very, very costly, both personally and professionally. And we've heard today a lot about the rules-based and the principles-based. Whatever the basis is, make sure you understand it. Understand the risks that you're taking. Get to know your board. I would like to say that it's the appointee's responsibility as well as the corporate secretary and the board's responsibility to be onboarded. So if you go in and you don't see anybody talking about, well, I'm going to introduce you to what this company, what this organization does. I'm going to make these documents available to you. I'm going to share these minutes. I hope as an outcome of the extensive list that Bernard made today, that you made a note, or you get the recording and you listen to it and you make a note and you start asking for all of those things. It is equally the responsibility of the appointee as well as the board. Are there any other closing remarks? I see you're involved in a lively chat there, Mariana. Would you like to make any further comment?
No, I think that the changes that have been done in Jamaica are by and large the changes that ought to be done in Trinidad.
Right.
And as Ronnie was pointing out, that's in anticipation of that, some of those changes are in fact presumed necessarily have to be made consistent across a spectrum of legislation where procurement legislation is. I think the critical issue, and it get down to brass tacks, is the reason why we haven't made those type of adjustments, not that we don't know, but we would not have. There's been no external propulsion because there certainly is none internally to make it happen. By and large, the country has acquiesced in a feeling that this is the way that business is done, rather than say, for example, this is not how we want it to succeed in the future. I think that is the change, so that the conflict between rules and principles do exist, only because the society, by and large, although we will make some complaints, make some annoyance, we haven't stuck to our guns and said, this is something that we will not tolerate, regardless of which party is in office. We have not yet reached that stage. And the critical issues and the points, the areas in which are most critical from the point of view of board appointments are the enterprises which effectively carry out government procurement. Or government. That's the devil is in the detail. It's not about some individuals who have been appointed there. Not necessarily who, while government could be blamed on their actions, and their actions may not have nothing to do with government. It may be very well self-intentional. I leave it at that note.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Joanne, I wonder what was meant by enforced compromises by Mariano.
Enforced compromises meaning that IDB and the World Bank themselves have requested and made changes to some of those governance processes. I'm not saying that the private sector was not on board. I'm not saying that the private sector was not in agreement with them. I'm simply saying that there was a willingness to compromise as a result of other external parties being involved.
I hear you.
Yeah. Now, folks, unless there are, let me just check the chat, unless there are any other burning contributions, can I thank, I'll pass over to Faye, but can I say, I am going to be listening to this recording when it comes out because there were so many notes I tried to take. I just couldn't keep up with all the notes. But thank you very much. You've made my job very easy. Thank you very much for your contribution and your stimulating advice.